Lu Yun sat at the head of the conference table, her fingers drumming impatiently against the polished surface of her laptop. The investors sat in front of her, their faces blank slates, each absorbed in their own thoughts, eyes half-lidded with boredom. She couldn't blame them. Time had stretched on in these meetings like a never-ending sitcom, every pitch feeling like a rerun of something they'd already seen a dozen times. The venture capitalists weren't interested in another startup with a great idea. They wanted something revolutionary. Something different. Lu Yun had always been that, different, but today, even her edge felt dull, her pulse quickened as she glanced at her watch, 10:04 a.m. There was still time to save the meeting. She adjusted the collar of her jacket and cleared her throat dramatically, attempting to catch their attention. "Let me show you something different," she said with a smirk, the kind she had perfected over the years, the kind that had earned her a reputation in the tech world for being audacious, even reckless. She leaned forward, pressing a button on her device, the size of a small phone, nestled on the table before her. A faint hum filled the air, and the screen of her laptop flickered to life. A sleek interface appeared, showcasing a graph of possible futures, a visualization of time itself. Introducing the future of time manipulation, she continued. A device that allows you to pause, rewind, and fast-forward moments. It's practical. It's efficient. It's the ultimate tool for maximizing potential, optimizing productivity, and, she paused, eyeing the investors as they shifted in their seats, no longer hiding their skepticism. But they were still listening. Still interested, however faintly. The quiet hum of the machine grew louder, almost in sync with the rising anxiety in Lu Yun's chest. She pressed a few more buttons. A flash of light lit the room, and everything around her stilled. The investors' faces froze mid-expression, their mouths slightly open in surprise. The clicking of a distant pen paused in the air. Lu Yun's heart raced. She had done it, paused time, right in front of them. Incredible. In the perfect moment of triumph, she let out a small laugh of disbelief. She was too good at this. A voice broke through the stillness, jarring her senses. "Is this it?" The voice was sharp, cracked with an edge of weariness that struck Lu Yun as deeply unsettling. "Is this what you've become?" Lu Yun whirled around, only to find herself face to face with herself. A woman, graying hair, worn leather jacket, tired eyes. The figure who stood before her could have been an older version of herself, but with the kind of harshness only time's bruises could bring. The woman's gaze was steady, unblinking, but there was something more in her eyes, a deep, frantic urgency. "You need to stop," the older Lu Yun said, her voice cutting through the frozen air like a knife. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're tearing the fabric of reality apart, and soon, you won't be able to fix it." Lu Yun's jaw dropped. She'd seen plenty of strange things in her life, quantum fluctuations, impossible equations, glitches in the fabric of time, but this? This was different. The investors remained frozen, caught in the stilled moment. Lu Yun's fingers hovered over her device, the faintest tremor in her hand. "What? What is this? Who the hell are you?" She blinked, trying to dismiss the growing unease gnawing at her. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her face twisting in a grimace of frustration. "I'm you. Or, at least, I used to be," she said, each word heavy with warning. "I'm the future. Your future. And if you don't stop, if you keep using this device, you'll destroy everything." Lu Yun chuckled, though it was more nervous than confident now. This felt like some sort of bizarre tech-inspired nightmare. She reached forward, her fingers skimming the device's buttons, intending to rewind time just a few seconds to escape the conversation. It was a reflex. She'd done it hundreds of times before, but when she pressed the button, nothing happened. The woman smirked, as if reading her mind. "You think you can fix this with a press of a button? You can't, Lu Yun. You can't keep rewinding your mistakes, no matter how hard you try." Lu Yun's breath hitched. She stared at the device again, her fingers trembling. Was the device malfunctioning? No, it couldn't be. She'd tested it so many times. She shook her head, trying to focus. This is insane. You're not real. I mean, you're a version of me, but this is some kind of glitch. A bug in the system. You're a figment of my imagination, right? The woman raised her eyebrows, her expression darkening. Keep lying to yourself. But listen to me, Lu Yun. If you don't stop, if you don't put this device down and leave time alone, everything will break. Not just your world, but every world. The room shimmered for a moment, and Lu Yun felt a strange lurch in her stomach. For a second, the world wasn't still. The investors began to move again, slowly, as if time had been nudged back into place. The woman, the future version of Lu Yun, took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You're already making the first crack. The time fractures will grow, until reality itself can't hold anymore. We won't exist if you don't stop. Lu Yun's mind spun. Could this really be true? She'd always believed in the power of technology. Her device was the product of years of work, experimentation, and sheer brilliance. Surely, she was on the cusp of something revolutionary. Something the world needed. But was this warning real? Was the future version of herself really telling the truth? I don't know what to believe, Lu Yun muttered, her voice shaking despite herself. Of course you don't, the woman replied bitterly. You never do. But you will, soon enough. You'll see what happens when you start playing with forces you don't understand. There was a pause, the air thick with unspoken words. Then, with a sudden, almost exaggerated motion, the older Lu Yun reached for the device on the table, her fingers brushing it briefly. Destroy it, she said, a quiet desperation in her voice. Before it destroys you. And with that, she turned, disappearing into the shimmer of light as the room returned to normal, the investors oblivious to the strange exchange they had just witnessed. Lu Yun was left standing there, alone, her breath shallow, heart racing. She glanced down at the device in her hands, still humming softly. Could the future really be as the older Lu Yun said? Was she truly headed toward catastrophe? The meeting dragged on in a blur. Lu Yun couldn't focus. The words of the investors sounded hollow, distant, as if they were coming from underwater. She nodded along, offering vague responses, all the while her mind racing. She didn't have answers. Not yet. But one thing was clear, she had to figure this out. For once, she had no control over time, but she had control over whether she'd keep using it. Lu Yun could barely sleep that night. The events from the meeting replayed in her mind like an unskippable loop. The older version of herself had appeared so real, so insistent. She couldn't shake the haunting feeling that something had shifted. Time felt fragile now, like a crack waiting to split wide open. She reached over to her desk where the device sat. It was just a tool, something she'd designed to optimize life, to give people more time, more opportunities, more control. That was the point, wasn't it? Control. Time was the one thing no one could get enough of, and now she had figured out a way to bend it to her will. Or so she thought. What if the warning was true? She turned the device over in her hands. The faint hum of its energy vibrated through her fingertips. It felt warm, alive. That was how she'd always thought of it, like a creature, something that responded to her. But what if it was more than just a tool? What if it was alive, in a sense? Maybe it was telling her something. Maybe the universe itself was speaking through her. But no. She couldn't let herself believe in nonsense. There had to be an explanation. A logical one. Something she could fix. The next morning, she went to the lab. She had to check the device's components again. The warning from the older Lu Yun echoed in her head, but she pushed it aside as she typed code into her workstation, running diagnostics. Nothing was wrong with the hardware, the software, the algorithms. Everything was perfect. Yet, there was a feeling in her gut, a gnawing sense that something had shifted, something beyond her understanding. The more she tried to ignore it, the more her mind wandered back to the older Lu Yun. She punched a few commands into the system, attempting to replicate the anomaly she'd experienced the day before. She pressed the button to rewind time, just a few minutes. At first, the familiar sensation of everything around her stalling seemed comforting, like she had control again. But then it happened. The glitch. The distortion. The world around her shimmered, rippled like water disturbed by a stone. This time, she wasn't alone. The lab was different. Her workstation was now replaced by older, worn equipment, and there were papers scattered across the floor, papers that she had never seen before, papers with strange symbols and calculations that made no sense. But what struck her most was the feeling in the air. It was thick, heavy, like the very atmosphere was charged with something wrong, something broken. She heard a faint voice behind her. "You can't keep doing this." Lu Yun whipped around. It wasn't just the older version of herself this time. It was someone else. Another figure, cloaked in shadow, his face obscured. He stepped forward, and his presence seemed to warp the air around him, as if he existed on the edge of reality. "I told you," he said, his voice soft but laden with authority, "playing with time is like cracking open a door to something you can't control. Once you break it, you can't put it back." Lu Yun's heart pounded. She had no idea who this man was. He looked older, too, older than the version of her from yesterday, but in a different way. His hair was salt and pepper, his features sharp. His eyes, those eyes were familiar, somehow. I don't understand," she stammered. "Who are you?" The man's eyes softened, but there was no kindness in them. He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel the weight of his gaze. "I'm the one who tried to fix it," he said quietly, "before it was too late." The words felt like a punch to the chest. She stared at him, a mixture of confusion and dread coiling inside her. Was this another version of herself, too? A future Lu Yun, but one who had failed? "Why are you here?" she whispered. "Because I failed. And now, I'm trying to stop you from doing the same." His words hit her with the weight of a hammer. She wanted to fight back, to demand answers, but the silence that followed suffocated her. He wasn't lying. She could feel it in the air, in the strange buzzing around them. Something was wrong, and she had caused it. "You think you can outsmart time," he continued, his voice growing quieter, more urgent. "You think you can cheat it. But every time you use that device, it creates a fracture. A break. And each fracture is a thread you can never sew back together. It's already too late. The world is already starting to unravel. Can't you see it?" Lu Yun's mind raced. Unravel? What does he mean? She wanted to argue, to deny, to fight back. But deep down, a sinking feeling told her he was right. She glanced at the device in her hand. It was so small, so harmless looking. But she knew better. She had been warned. Time, reality, wasn't some game to be manipulated. It was delicate. Fragile. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, cracked tablet. On its screen was a series of fractured images, glitches in time, flashes of cities that weren't there, people who were supposed to be alive, but weren't. She could see herself in the images, distorted and broken. The sight made her stomach turn. "This is what happens when you keep breaking time," he said. "This is the future you're creating." Lu Yun recoiled. "No. This can't be real." She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back. But there was nothing she could say. The evidence was right there in front of her. I didn't mean to," she whispered. He nodded, his face tight with regret. "None of us do. But intention doesn't matter. It's the consequences that will break us all." She stared at the device again, and for the first time, it felt like a weight, something heavy and wrong in her hands. She had built it to help, to make life easier, to give people the power to change the impossible. But now she could see it for what it truly was. A tool for destruction. The man stepped back, and the world around her began to ripple again, the edges of reality growing hazy, as if he, too, was being pulled away. "Stop using it," he said, his voice a fading echo. "Before it's too late." And then, just like that, he was gone. Lu Yun was alone in the lab again, but the silence was different now. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It was cold. And the weight of the device in her hands felt unbearable. She had been warned. And now, she had to make a choice. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lu Yun couldn't focus on her work. Every time she tried, her mind wandered back to the meeting, to the man's cryptic warning. She couldn't stop thinking about the fracture he'd shown her, the destruction that had already begun. The idea of destroying the device seemed impossible. After everything she'd worked for, everything she had built, how could she just walk away from it? How could she throw it all away? But what if it was already too late? She stayed up late that night, staring at the device in her hands, weighing the decision. Her mind raced, running through every scenario, every possible outcome. Could she fix the damage? Could she save everything she had worked for? Or was she already too far gone? A strange thought crossed her mind. What if the device had already been used? What if the person who had warned her, whoever they were, wasn't just some stranger, but another version of herself? A version from a future that had already been broken? A version that had been left behind because she hadn't listened. The thought chilled her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized something else. The device wasn't the problem. She was. The moment she picked it up, the moment she decided to use it, she had taken control. But control had come at a price. And now, the price was the very fabric of time itself. Lu Yun had a decision to make, but there was no easy answer. In the end, she knew what she had to do. The device was too dangerous. It was too unpredictable. It had to be destroyed. But there was no going back. No undoing the damage she had caused, and so, with a final breath, she powered it down. The device powered down with a faint, mechanical whir. The humming stopped, and for a moment, Lu Yun held it in her hand, staring at it. It felt strangely light, as if it had never been more than a trinket, an insignificant piece of technology. She should have felt relief. After all, she had made the decision to destroy it. But as she stared at the device, the weight of the world seemed to settle onto her shoulders. The decision was final. There was no going back. She tossed the device onto her desk and stood up, pacing. The lab felt different, quieter than before. There were no flashing lights, no hums of machinery in the background, no quiet buzz in the air as if time itself was bending and shifting around her. It was just silence. Absolute, eerie silence, but there was still that nagging question that had been haunting her all day. Had it already been too late? Had the fractures already spread too far? Was this really the end of the line for her, or had she just delayed the inevitable? The future she had seen in the man's tablet, the cracks in time, the distorted images, kept resurfacing in her mind. It had been a vision, yes, but it had felt so real. Her heart ached at the thought of what might happen if she had made the wrong choice. "Stop overthinking," she muttered to herself, though her voice wavered. "You did the right thing. It's over." She walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The bright lights of the building seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive, a reminder that life still went on, regardless of her choices. She wasn't sure what time it was, morning, afternoon, night. Time felt irrelevant now. She had once believed that time was a fixed thing, something to be conquered, mastered, and shaped according to her will. But now she knew better. Time was a force, a tide that could never truly be controlled. It was a humbling thought. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her, interrupting her train of thought. She glanced at it. It was a message from her friend, Li Wei. "I heard about the device. Are you okay?" Her fingers hovered over the screen. She knew Li Wei cared, but how could she explain any of this? How could she tell him what had really happened, what she had really done? The words wouldn't come. She deleted the message, setting the phone aside. Lu Yun sighed and returned to the desk. The device was still there, its small form sitting like an abandoned relic. The thought of throwing it away crossed her mind, but she hesitated. There was a part of her that still couldn't let go. What if? She thought. What if I could make it work? What if I could fix everything? She quickly shoved that thought aside. No. It was done. For a moment, she simply stared at the device, wondering what kind of future she would have now. The future she had glimpsed in the warning from her older self seemed far away now, like a dream she had already forgotten. But it was a dream that felt like it could come true, if she wasn't careful. The idea of letting go of something she had worked so hard to create felt like an impossible loss. But the consequences of holding on were far worse. "I'll start over," she whispered aloud to the empty room. "I'll make something better." The words felt hollow, but they were the only ones she could say with any conviction. There was no going back to the way things were before, but that didn't mean there wasn't hope for a new kind of future. As the night stretched on, Lu Yun sat at her desk, letting the quiet of the lab settle around her. It was peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in years. No more gadgets humming, no more scrambling to beat the clock. The pressure that had always weighed on her shoulders seemed to lift, and though it wasn't gone, it felt manageable. Normal, even. She thought back to the warning she had received. The older Lu Yun. The man from the future. Had it really been real? She wasn't sure. She couldn't say. But the fragments she had seen, the cracks in time, felt real enough. And so, for once, she chose to believe the warning. Maybe it was time to stop trying to manipulate everything, to stop pretending she could control the uncontrollable. There was a sudden flash of light, and Lu Yun jumped back, instinctively reaching for the desk. She looked around the room, her heart racing. Nothing had changed. No glitches. No time loops. Just the same empty room she had been sitting in for the last few hours. Then it happened again. A brief flicker, followed by the unmistakable shimmer of something shifting in the air. Lu Yun's breath caught in her throat. Before she could move, she felt it, a presence behind her, one that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned slowly, dreading what she might see. The older Lu Yun stood there. The same woman from before, but now her appearance was more solid, more tangible, as if she had stepped out of a ripple in time itself. She was looking at Lu Yun with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "You didn't listen to me," the older Lu Yun said, her voice weary, but there was a strange relief in her eyes. "But you will." Lu Yun couldn't speak. Her mind raced as she stared at the woman who was supposed to be her future, or at least a version of it. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. How? She had destroyed the device. She had done everything she was supposed to do. "I told you to stop using the device," the older version of herself continued, taking a step closer. "And I warned you that I might not be able to stop the damage, even if I tried. But there's still time to fix it. Not much, but enough." Lu Yun felt a chill run down her spine. Her eyes flicked to the device on the desk, and for the briefest moment, it almost seemed to shimmer, as though it were calling to her. "You didn't destroy it," the older Lu Yun said, her tone soft, almost sad. "You can't destroy it. It's part of you now. It always has been. You can't undo what's been done." Lu Yun shook her head, trying to block out the growing panic inside her. No. No, I did destroy it. I threw it away. I did what you said. The older Lu Yun's face softened, but her gaze remained steady. You don't understand. It's never about the device. It's about you. You can't escape what you are, no matter how hard you try. That's why I came back. To show you that you can't fix time by breaking it. But there's still time to fix yourself. You have to face what you've done. Lu Yun felt the weight of those words settle over her. Fix myself. How was she supposed to do that? She couldn't undo the mistakes. She couldn't go back and make different choices. But somehow, she knew, deep down, that this was the only way forward. The device, the future, the warnings, it had all led her to this moment. She looked up at the older version of herself, who now seemed to be fading, like mist being blown away by the wind. Is it too late? Lu Yun whispered, her voice trembling. Have I already broken everything? The older Lu Yun smiled gently, but the sadness in her eyes was unmistakable. No, she said softly, her form beginning to dissolve. It's never too late. But you have to make the choice. And you have to be brave enough to live with it. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the older version of Lu Yun was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the empty lab behind her. Lu Yun stood there, alone again. But something had changed. The weight that had once pressed so heavily on her chest, her guilt, her fear, her need to control, seemed to lift. If only for a moment. She looked down at the desk, at the place where the device had been, and realized that the hardest part was not destroying it. The hardest part was accepting that she couldn't control time. Not now, not ever. And that, in itself, was the beginning of something new.